Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into Mustafa İslamoğlu's framework for understanding Allah's beautiful names, the Esmâ-ül Hüsna.
So, let's kick things off with a deep question. What actually separates fleeting pleasure from true, lasting happiness?
Well, pleasure vanishes the second your situation changes, but permanent happiness, that stays securely anchored deep within you.
Finding that permanent happiness means aligning your own will with the divine will, totally locked in like gears.
It's a mindset that literally wipes out despair. You learn to accept God's wrath and grace equally. Okay, to actually reach this state, İslamoğlu outlines three key pillars: learning, correcting tradition, and practical application.
That first pillar, Talim, argues you literally cannot worship God sincerely without deeply understanding His beautiful names.
Then comes correction. Surprisingly, he claims traditional, historical lists of these names actually contain some serious inconsistencies.
Here's the core issue. Tradition mistakenly took God's temporary actions, his verbs, and turned them into permanent names. So he introduces a strict rule. You just can't arbitrarily turn a divine verb into a divine name.
By applying this strict rule directly to the Quran, he extracted exactly 99 distinct names. Pretty fascinating, right?
But wait, there's more. To truly grasp them, you have to study these names chronologically as they were revealed.
Like names bringing hope appeared during those tough Meccan years, while names about peace logically came much later.
And you know when names are paired together in the text? That sequence is highly deliberate, never random. For instance, God asserts absolute independence first as Aziz, before following up with his divine wisdom as Hakim.
All right, that brings us to the final step, tatbiq, actually applying these divine names to our everyday behaviors.
Think about the universal mercy of Rahman versus the specific, human-focused compassion of the name Rahim.
He points out a tragic flaw. Some show that universal mercy to animals, but deny basic compassion to humans.
Wrapping up this explainer, ask yourself, how do these divine names actually manifest in your own daily interactions?
All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're tackling something that's both incredibly deep and, honestly, super practical. We are going to decode the 99 names of Allah, the Esmâ-ül Hüsna, to figure out how they actually unlock true, lasting contentment in our daily lives. We'll be diving into a really rigorous, systematic study of the Quranic text that literally strips away centuries of confusion to reveal a crystal clear path forward. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. True happiness and will, 2. 3 methods in knowledge, 3. Leave ash, take ember, 4. Verb, verse, name, 5. The secret of the 99 names, and finally, number 6. Applying the Esma to life. Let's get started. Kicking things off with section 1, true happiness and will, aligning with the divine. Think about it like this. God has established an entire system to illuminate our lives, right? But we often resist joining it. And by staying on the outside, all of our massive human potential just sits there, completely idle. And you know what happens when potential sits idle? It gets lost. So to avoid that, the source highlights 2 core concepts. First up is marfatullah. Now this isn't just reciting facts or knowing God exists. It's a deep, profound comprehension of him. Because let's be real, you cannot truly serve a God you don't intimately understand. The second concept is rizaya ramwamak. When you truly understand God, your human will, your partial will, locks perfectly into his universal will. It's literally like 2 gears syncing up. You actually start wanting for yourself exactly what he wants for you. And this brilliantly illustrates the difference between what we think we want and what actually sustains us. We spend so much time chasing fleeting pleasure, a quick joy, a thrill. But pleasure is so incredibly fragile. I mean, just the mere thought that a joyous moment is going to end is enough to ruin the joy itself. But true mutluluk, or true happiness, that's completely different. True happiness is an eternal state connected directly to the divine. Once it enters your heart, it doesn't leave, because it is absolutely immune to worldly loss. To really anchor this idea, the source shares an amazing perspective on the prophet Ayub, or Job. When he was suffering, he didn't actually complain to God about his physical illness. Instead, he complained that the devil was causing him spiritual weariness. The illness? Just a detail. His real fear was that weariness would distance him from God. When your will is locked with the divine, you reach this incredible point where you can honestly say, whether a rose or a thorn, it is pleasing to me. True peace comes from accepting whatever the divine sends, knowing it's just part of the ultimate system. Moving right along to Section 2, 3 Basic Methods in Knowledge, a Structured Path. Okay, so how do we actually learn this systematically? The text outlines 3 very specific steps. Step 1 is talim, acquiring knowledge, ideally face-to-face. But listen, there's a vital rule here. In this tradition, having good character absolutely must precede the knowledge itself. Knowledge without the moral framework to use it, that's considered dangerous. Step 2 is tashih, refining the historical tradition. And step 3 is tatbiq, actually applying all of this to your everyday life. Which brings us to Section 3, Tradition, Leave Ash, Take Ember. This section addresses exactly how we should handle historical Islamic scholarship when we're studying the names of God. And I absolutely love this metaphor from the source material. Carry the ember, not the ash. When we look back at the incredible scholars of the past, we greet them with immense respect, right? We benefit from their work. But we shouldn't blindly worship the ashes of past tradition. Our job isn't to carry dead ash forward, no. Our job is to find the glowing ember, that core truth, blow the ash away, and bring that fire right into the present day. Now, this brings up a massive point of tension. It turns out those famous historical lists of the 99 names, like the ones you'll find in the collections of Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, actually have some significant academic and textual issues. Scholars have known for centuries that these specific lists were likely later additions. They don't perfectly match each other, and get this, they even include names not found in the Quran. So, if we can't completely rely on the traditional lists, how do we confidently know God's true names? Well, we have to go directly to the source, the Quran. That takes us to Section 4, Difference between Verb and Name, the core rule. When we're extracting names directly from the Quran, we need some really strict parameters. The biggest mistake past compilers made was confusing af'alullah, which are God's verbs, with Esma-Allah, God's names. Verbs represent contextual actions, right? They start, they stop, they change based on the situation. Names, on the other hand, represent God's constant, unchanging essence. It is a huge theological error to take a contextual action of God, like, say, misleading someone who chose a dark path or plotting against deceivers, and improperly turn that verb into a fixed, permanent name. God acts, sure, but those actions don't automatically become his absolute title. To filter the Quran and find the genuine names without just arbitrarily making them up, the speaker applied some incredibly strict rules. First, you cannot derive names from infinitives. Second, you cannot derive them from verbs randomly. And above all else, you must be perfectly consistent. If you turn one verb into a name, you'd have to do it for all of them, and that would result in over 180 names, many of them highly inappropriate. So the rule is crystal clear. Only accept the explicit, absolute names provided in the text. All right, get ready for Section 5, the secret of the 99 names in the Quran, the dramatic reveal. So the researchers spent months meticulously scanning every single word of the Quranic text with these rigid rules. And applying this remarkably strict methodology yielded an astounding result. You know, the researcher actually believed the famous number 99 was probably just a metaphor for a multitude. But after stripping away the flawed historical lists, discarding the verbs, and scanning the text with absolute grammatical rigidity, exactly 99 names remained. Exactly 99 names alongside the supreme name Allah. This brilliantly proves the authenticity of that core, well-known prophetic tradition stating there were 99 names. Even if the later attached lists were flawed, the number itself was a perfect, literal truth hidden right there in the text. Mind-blowing, right? And check this out. Notice how the chronological order of revelation completely shifts the psychological impact of these names. The names aren't just random, they're an educational tool. For example, Al-Fatah, the opener, is only revealed during the Meccan period, right when the early believers were oppressed, stuck, and in deep distress. They needed the ultimate hope of the opener. But then you have Esh-Shakir, the appreciative, and that appears in the Medinan period when they had established a society, safety, and a state. Context is literally everything here. The precision goes even further. When names are paired together at the end of verses, they follow strict logic. Take the pair Aziz meaning mighty and Hakim meaning wise. In the Quran, Aziz always precedes Hakim. It is never, ever reversed. Why? Because God is establishing a psychological boundary. He first asserts his ultimate independence and might, reminding humans that they are totally reliant on him, and he needs nothing. Only after establishing that power does he display his wisdom. Finally, we arrive at section 6, applying Esma to life, the final step. Look, if this entire theological deep dive doesn't actually change our daily behavior on the ground, it's just academic trivia. Consider the two most famous names, recited every single day, Rahman and Rahim. The source presents a really hard-hitting anecdote about this. Rahman is universal mercy, providing for all of creation. Rahim is specific, forgiving mercy, often directed toward believers. Now, you'll see people who manifest Rahman beautifully, right? They feed street animals, they care for the environment, yet they entirely lack the Rahim required to just forgive their own family members or community members for simple mistakes. Which leaves us with a pretty profound challenge. Are you living a half Bismaili life? Are you taking one aspect of divine mercy and completely ignoring the other? Understanding the Esma-ül Hüsna isn't about memorizing a list. It's about evaluating your own spiritual balance. It's about locking your will into the divine will. So I'll leave you with this. How will you let the precision, the context, and the reality of these 99 names transform your actions and your well today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.
Imagine taking like 1,000-year-old tradition, one that's revered by over 1 billion people,
Right.
and then realizing that mathematically and linguistically, almost everyone might actually be using the wrong words to talk to the creator of the universe.
Yeah, and then imagine that the scholar who's pointing all this out, he's not trying to attack that tradition at all.
Exact.
Instead, he's using this incredibly rigid, almost like mathematical set of grammatical rules to actually rescue it.
Which is mind-blowing.
It really is. And in doing so, he claims to have uncovered a framework that is, well, it's just essentially the literal cure for human despair.
Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are looking at a monumental, genuinely paradigm-shifting lecture by Mustafa İslamoğlu today.
Yeah, it's a heavy one.
It is. The subject matter is the Esmâ-ül Hüsna, the beautiful names of God within the Islamic tradition. But if you are listening to this right now, I need you to just throw away whatever assumptions you might have.
Yeah, completely toss them out.
Right, because we aren't looking at this as like a list of vocabulary words you just memorize in Sunday school.
No, not at all.
The source material presents this as a highly structural, shockingly complex system for human psychology, really, and rigorous linguistic philosophy.
Absolutely. And I think it's vital to establish our ground rules right at the top here.
Definitely.
Our mission today is not to preach,
Yeah.
Or to convert or to tell you what to believe. We're just here to impartially explore this text as a really fascinating intellectual construct.
Because it is. It demands so much aggressive critical thinking from the reader.
It really does. We're going to unpack how the speaker uses just absolute linguistic precision to challenge like centuries of accepted scholarly consensus.
So it is a bold move.
Very bold. And how he presents the understanding of these divine attributes as a literal blueprint for navigating the friction of human existence.
So let's just jump right into the deep end, because the source opens with a very stark, almost uncompromising premise.
Right, the concept of the system.
Yeah. The speaker argues that there is a system, a sort of universal channel or operating frequency that's meant to illuminate human existence. But humans, generally speaking, we stubbornly resist joining it.
We actively fight against it.
Exactly. Yeah. We actively fight being part of this system. And the text warns that by choosing to stay outside of it, our incredible human potential, it doesn't just pause.
No, it doesn't sit neutrally.
Right. It remains idle, and because it's idle, it decays. It eventually turns into something void, something false. I think the specific word he uses is batul.
Yeah, batul. And the causality the speaker establishes here is just fascinating, especially when you view it through a psychological lens.
How so?
Well, think about your own life or, anyone you know who's incredibly gifted but lacks direction.
Oh, yeah. We all know someone like that.
Right. Unutilized potential is not a neutral state. It is an active state of decay. It generates friction, anxiety, and eventually toxicity.
It makes total sense.
So to prevent this existential decay, the source argues that a human being has to actively return to the truth, to this overarching system.
And to facilitate that return, the text outlines 3 legitimate paths, right? 3 ways to connect with the divine.
Exactly, the 3 paths.
So the first is dia, which translates to prayer or calling out. The second is sali amel, meaning righteous deeds or constructive action. And the third, which is really the absolute centerpiece of our deep dive today, is the Esma-ül Hüsna, the beautiful names.
And the speaker makes a massive philosophical claim here.
He does. He basically states that without knowing these names, the divine literally cannot be known.
Right, and therefore cannot be understood.
Exactly. And if you don't understand the entity or the system you are trying to connect with, well, true alignment is impossible. You're just like stumbling around in the dark, hoping you hit the right frequency.
Which introduces one of the most critical distinctions in the entire lecture, actually.
Oh, the difference between knowing and understanding.
Yes. Okay, let's unpack this. It draws a very hard line between simply knowing something and deeply understanding it. The speaker uses the term marifatullah.
Right. So this isn't rote memorization.
Not at all. It's not knowing that water is made of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom.
Right, that's just data.
Exactly. Marifatullah is understanding what it feels like to be hydrated.
Yeah.
It's understanding the power of a river or, the danger of drowning.
Oh, wow. I love that analogy.
You can't just memorize a list of names. You have to understand the fundamental mechanics behind them. Because if you lack that profound comprehension, how can you possibly align your life with it?
That distinction between knowing as data and understanding as integration is huge. And the text argues that when you finally achieve that integration, you reach this state called Ram Olmak.
Yes, Ram Olmak. It's a Persian concept, right?
Yeah, derived from Persian, but used widely in Turkish and Islamic literature. It essentially means to yield, to submit, or to be completely tamed.
But the way he describes it isn't like breaking a horse.
No. The way the source describes it is so mechanical, it's almost like engineering. It's about how your individual, limited free will, your Quranic, interacts with the massive, universal divine will, the Quranic.
It's the ultimate friction point of human existence, isn't
Yeah.
it? The tension between what we want right now and what the universe actually demands.
Exactly. The text describes this submission not as giving up or like collapsing in defeat, but as locking perfectly into place.
Like 2 massive interlocking gears.
Right, like gears. But, when I was reading this, the gear analogy felt just a little static to me.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, I was trying to visualize what this actually feels like for a person trying to live it. And I realized it's not like riding a tandem bicycle where you just let go of the handlebars. It's much more like orbital mechanics.
Orbital mechanics. Wait, walk me through that.
Okay, think about it. When a satellite is launched into space, it encounters the massive, inescapable gravitational pull of a planet, right? That gravity is the Quranic, the universal will. It is going to pull you in no matter what. Now, the satellite has its own thrusters, its own limited power.
Ah, the Quranic, our individual free will.
Exactly. Now, if the satellite uses its thrusters to fight the gravity, to try and fly directly away from the planet, it's going to burn through all its fuel, exhaust itself, and eventually crash back down.
Right. It can't win that fight.
And that is human despair. That's fighting the system.
Huh.
But if the satellite uses its thrusters to perfectly match its velocity sideways, aligning with the curvature of the pole,
It enters orbit.
it enters orbit. It is in a state of perpetual, frictionless freefall. It's still moving, it still has energy, but its trajectory has perfectly aligned with the massive force pulling on it.
Wow.
Ram Olmak is achieving orbit. It's the moment you stop burning fuel to fight the gravity and instead use your will to glide along it.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it.
Mhm.
Because what you're describing is a state where the resistance literally drops to 0.
Yeah, zero friction.
The text explicitly argues that when you reach this state of Ram Olmak, what the divine wants for you becomes indistinguishable from what you want for yourself.
The satellite doesn't feel the gravity as a prison anymore.
Exactly. It experiences it as the path of least resistance. And this complete synchronization, this zero friction state, it completely forces a redefinition of what we consider happiness.
Oh, man. This part of the source is just devastating to our modern culture. It absolutely dismantles how we define a good life today.
It really takes a scalpel to our modern vocabulary. The source draws this incredibly sharp distinction between true happiness and temporary emotional states.
Right. It separates out things like pleasure, joy, delight.
Yeah, has, nesha, kiif, as if those are entirely separate from actual happiness. And the psychological reasoning here is brilliant in its simplicity.
What's fascinating here is how he frames temporality, right?
Yes. The speaker argues that these temporary states cannot be true happiness because the sheer awareness of their temporality is enough to destroy them.
Oh, that is so true. Think about how true that is for you right now listening to this. You can be on the most expensive, beautiful beach vacation in the entire world. You are experiencing peak delight.
But then you look at your watch
Right. The second your brain clicks and says, my flight leaves in 36 hours and I have 400 unread emails, the pleasure just fractures.
The physical environment hasn't changed at all.
The sun is still warm, but the delight is dead.
Precisely. A joy that can flee, a pleasure that has an expiration date, it just cannot be defined as true happiness in this framework.
Though it has to be permanent.
Therefore, the text argues true happiness must, by definition, be permanent. It must be something that, once it takes root in your existence, cannot be taken away by changing circumstances.
Right.
And logically, according to this philosophical architecture, you cannot achieve permanent happiness unless you attach yourself to something permanent. You have to connect to the eternal, to the divine.
Which brings us to the story the speaker uses to hammer this point home, and it's a re-examination of the prophet Job, or Ayub.
Ah, yes. The ultimate case study in suffering.
Right. If you know the story of Job from any of the Abrahamic traditions, you know he goes through horrific suffering. He loses his wealth, his family, his health. He is covered in agonizing physical disease.
He loses everything.
But the text points out something totally mind-blowing about the exact words Job uses when he finally calls out to God. He does not complain about the pain.
No, he doesn't. And that distinction is the key to understanding the entire philosophy.
Right, because what does he actually say?
When Job speaks to the divine, the text highlights that he says Satan has afflicted him with weariness or distress. He isn't filing like a medical grievance about the boils on his skin.
Right, he's not angry about the physical agony.
The profound realization the speaker brings out is that Job is complaining because the sheer exhaustion and weariness of the illness might distract him.
Wow.
He is terrified that the physical toll will cause his mind to distance itself from God. The physical illness is entirely secondary. The integrity of his connection to the divine system is his only actual priority.
It is the ultimate manifestation of achieving orbit. The text uses this gorgeous poetic imagery to describe this mindset.
Yeah, the rose and the thorn.
Yes. It says that when you are truly aligned like Job, the external stimuli just stop mattering. It doesn't matter if the universe hands you a rose or thorn.
Or shroud versus a silken robe.
Exactly. Whether the script of your life calls for you to laugh or to cry, you accept it with zero friction. The text envisions a person saying, if you make me laugh, my smile is my witness. If you make me cry, my tears are my witness.
Beautiful.
Because you trust the gravitational pull so implicitly that you welcome the trajectory no matter what scenery you pass along the way.
What you're describing is the absolute eradication of despair.
Eradication of despair. I like that.
Yeah, because if your individual will is perfectly locked into the universal will, hopelessness becomes a logical impossibility.
Right, because everything is part of the plan.
Every single thing, the promotion, the bankruptcy, the health, the sickness, it is instantly categorized as part of the accepted, perfect design. You have cut off the supply lines to the very roots of sorrow.
And that, and only that, is what the speaker defines as happiness.
Exactly.
Okay, but as a person living in the real world, hearing all this, reaching this zen-like zero-friction state of total alignment, it sounds impossibly difficult.
It's a tall order.
We can't all be the prophet Job. How does a normal human being dealing with traffic and taxes and heartbreak actually rewire their brain to do this?
Right, the practical application.
And that question perfectly transitions us into the methodology of the source, because the speaker doesn't just present this lofty goal, right? He lays out a really rigorous three-step educational architecture to actually get there.
Yes. The text outlines a specific curriculum built on three foundational pillars.
The 3 T's, I call them.
Right. Talim, which translates to learning or instruction. Tashi, which is correcting, sifting, or refining. And Tatbik, which is the actual application in daily life.
Okay, let's begin with the first pillar, Talim.
And this is where the text throws a massive curveball. Because under the banner of learning, the speaker initiates a profound critique of how we, in the modern world, actually gather information.
Oh, this part was fascinating. The East versus West epistemology.
Yes. He draws a stark contrast between traditional Eastern or Islamic thought and Western or Greek thought. The text argues that in the Greek tradition, which is the foundation of modern Western education, the acquisition of knowledge comes first.
Right. You learn the facts, you get the data.
You discover the science, and then supposedly you figure out the morality of it later.
It's an epistemology that separates the data from the user. It allows for this concept of immoral knowledge, or at least amoral knowledge.
Think about the Manhattan Project.
Exactly. The physics, the pursuit of splitting the atom, was treated as a pure pursuit of knowledge. The moral implications of, dropping a nuclear bomb, that was a secondary debate, dealt with only after the knowledge was acquired.
In stark contrast, the tradition the speaker is defending insists that morality must always precede knowledge.
Morality comes first.
Always. You do not seek knowledge to become a moral person. You must undergo the brutal work of establishing your ethical foundation first, constructing a pure vessel within yourself, and then you seek knowledge.
So the knowledge has a safe place to go.
Exactly. So it has a righteous container to inhabit. If the vessel is cracked or corrupted with ego, the purest knowledge in the universe will turn into poison the moment it's poured inside.
To really drive this home, the text points to a very specific prayer from the Prophet Muhammad. He famously prayed to seek refuge from knowledge that provides no benefit.
Such a counterintuitive concept for us today.
It really is. Think about how you consume information today. We are obsessed with data. We scroll through infinite feeds, absorbing geopolitics, science facts, celebrity gossip.
Just hoarding information.
Right. To a modern ear, the idea of actively avoiding knowledge sounds almost anti-intellectual. But the text forces you to ask, what makes knowledge useless?
And the speaker breaks this down masterfully. Knowledge that provides no benefit operates on two distinct levels.
Okay, what's the first level?
The first level is obvious, information that is inherently devoid of value. Gossip, hyper-niche trivia that serves no purpose, data that merely clutters the mind.
Sure, junk food for the brain.
Right. But the second level is much more profound and directly challenges the listener. It refers to knowledge that might be objectively true, incredibly profound and universally valuable. But it fails to actually benefit the specific person who learned it.
It's the difference between knowing the theory and actually being transformed by it.
Exactly. If you read the greatest works of philosophy, if you memorize sacred texts, if you understand the deepest mechanics of the universe, but that knowledge does not change your behavior.
If it doesn't reduce your ego.
Right. If it doesn't bring you 1 inch closer to that zero friction alignment with the divine will, then for you, that knowledge is entirely useless.
It's just dead weight.
It is just dead weight you are carrying around to sound smart at dinner parties.
Yeah.
True talim is knowledge that acts as a catalyst for transformation.
Okay, so assuming you get that right, assuming you've prepared your moral vessel and you're seeking transformative knowledge, you almost immediately hit a brick wall.
The wall of history.
Yes, history.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second pillar, tashi, or correction. And I have to say, the analogy the speaker uses here is one of the most striking I've ever come across.
It's a great one. It deals with how we are supposed to handle tradition, right?
Yeah. The massive, towering legacy of past scholars, ancestors, and centuries of religious thought.
It really addresses that tension between blind traditionalism and arrogant modernism. How do you respect the past without being suffocated by it?
So the speaker uses the imagery of a campfire. He likens historical tradition to an ancestral hearth.
Okay.
Over centuries, a fire burns, providing light and heat. But a fire also produces a massive amount of ash. The goal of a seeker today is not to just scoop up everything in the fire pit. If you do that, you're mostly carrying dead gray dust that will choke you.
You're just carrying ash.
Right. Your job is to reach into that hearth and carry forward only the glowing ember, the kuz. You have to actively, carefully blow away the dead ashes of tradition, the cool, to find the burning, radiant truth hidden inside.
You don't disrespect the hearth, but you don't worship the ash.
Exactly. And that process of blowing away the ash is exactly what tashi means. It is the rigorous, sometimes painful process of critical refinement.
You must have the courage to separate the human errors, the cultural biases, and the historical misinterpretations from the divine ember.
And the speaker doesn't just offer this as like a poetic metaphor. He uses this exact principle to justify doing something incredibly controversial.
He does.
He is blowing the ashes off one of the most universally recognized elements of Islamic tradition.
This is the turning point of the deep dive, really.
Yeah.
Because if you hear a scholar say we need to blow away the ashes of tradition, the immediate question is,
what specific tradition are you targeting?
Exactly. And he targets the lists of the 99 names of God.
Hold on. The 99 names, if you go into almost any Muslim household anywhere in the world, you will see the 99 names.
Absolutely.
They're on posters, they're woven into calligraphy, they're memorized by children. It is the bedrock of how the divine is understood. And the speaker is standing up and saying, these lists are flawed.
That's exactly what he's saying.
How does a scholar justify dismantling 1,000 years of accepted consensus? I mean, it's like a modern physicist saying we need to throw out Newton's original formulas and start from scratch.
It requires immense academic courage, for sure. But his justification is rooted entirely in the science of hadith criticism and strict linguistic logic.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the source acknowledges that there is a highly authentic, universally accepted hadith, a foundational saying of the Prophet, that states explicitly that God has 99 names.
Right.
But the critical structural detail the speaker points out is that the original highly authentic saying did not provide the list.
Wait, really? It just gave the number.
It only provided the number.
So where did the famous lists come from? The ones on all the posters?
The specific lists of 99 names largely come from other historical compilations, most notably the works of scholars like Ibn Majah and Tirmidhi.
Okay.
And the speaker argues, and backs this up with historical scholarship, that these specific lists suffer from severe transmission issues and textual weaknesses.
Wow.
Scholars of the past have actually long suspected that the actual lists of names were interpolations.
Additions made by later narrators.
Exactly. Later narrators trying to be helpful, trying to fill in the blank left by the prophet. They weren't the direct words of the original source.
And the speaker takes this historical doubt and pairs it with a brilliantly relatable logical argument about authority and naming.
The human relationships analogy.
Yes. He asks you to think about human relationships. If your best friend has a child, you wouldn't dare just invent a name for that baby and start calling them that, right?
Oh, of course not.
You wouldn't arbitrarily assign a new name to your spouse without their consent. It would be an insane breach of boundaries and incredibly arrogant.
Very arrogant.
So he asks, if we wouldn't dare name another human being without their permission, what gives humanity the audacity to invent, derive, or guess the names of the creator of the universe?
And the theological premise he establishes here is absolute and unyielding. Only God possesses the authority to name himself.
Period.
Therefore, any name attributed to the divine must be explicitly grammatically stated as a proper name by the divine within the foundational text, the Quran.
You can't just make one up based on what you see.
Humans cannot observe a divine action, run it through their own logic, and invent a title. The speaker argues that the historical lists are full of human-derived titles. They are the ashes.
And to find the ember, he establishes a methodology of extreme linguistic rigidity.
He throws out the historical lists of Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah entirely. He says, I am starting from zero. I'm going to scan the entire Quran, cover to cover, and I'm only going to extract names that survive a brutal set of linguistic rules.
So let's unpack these rules, because this is where the mechanics of his argument gets super fascinating.
The rules of derivation are strictly grammatical. The first major rule is you cannot derive a divine name from a verbal noun.
A masdar.
Yes, in Arabic grammar, this is known as a masdar. The text uses a very clear example to illustrate this. Take the concept of justice. In Arabic, the verbal noun for justice is adl.
Right.
The proper name meaning the just is adil. The speaker argues that if the text uses the word adl to describe a concept, you cannot arbitrarily upgrade that verbal noun into the proper name adil and slap it on a list.
Because if God wanted to be called Adil in that instance,
the text would explicitly use the word adil.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't turn a concept into a name. But his second rule is the one that really detonates the traditional lists.
The rule about verbs.
Right. The rule is you cannot derive a name from a verb, period.
Correct. And this is the primary mechanism by which the historical lists were actually built, which is why banning this practice is so controversial.
But let me push back on this, just as like a layperson trying to understand the logic here. Why is it wrong to derive a name from an action?
Okay, give me an example.
If I see a guy baking bread every single day, it is perfectly logical and linguistically sound for me to call him the baker, right?
Sure.
So if God performs an action in the text, let's say, God continuously provides sustenance, why is it grammatically or theologically wrong to derive a title from that action and call him the provider?
That seems like flawless logic, right? Until you apply that rule universally.
Ah.
And that is exactly the intellectual trap the speaker springs to dismantle the counter-argument. The speaker says, fine, let's say you want to derive names from verbs. If that is a valid methodology, then you must be logically consistent.
You can't pick and choose.
You must apply that rule to all the verbs attributed to divine action in the text. You cannot cherry pick. And there are over 180 verbs associated with God's actions in the Quran.
Oh, I see where this is going, the cherry-picking argument.
Exactly. The text uses a jarring example to expose the flaw in this methodology. It points to the Arabic verb yamut, which means to cause death.
Okay.
Historically, some scholars looked at that verb, applied the baker bakes bread logic, and derived the name mumit, meaning the bringer of death. And that name ended up on the traditional lists.
Okay, so far so good.
But the speaker argues if you use that exact same methodology, you have to look at another verb in the text.
Udil. And what does udil mean?
This verb means to mislead, to confound, or to allow to go astray.
Oh, wow.
If you follow your own rule of deriving names from verbs, you are logically forced to create a proper name from udil. That name would be dal, which translates to the misleader, or the one who leads astray.
And universally, across all schools of Islamic thought, attributing a permanent name like the misleader to God is considered theological blasphemy.
It is utterly unacceptable.
Wow. So by forcing the methodology to its logical extreme, he proves that turning verbs into names fundamentally breaks the theology.
It shatters it.
You can't just scan the text, pick the pleasant, comforting verbs to make names, and then ignore the complex, difficult verbs. The methodology itself is corrupted. You have to stop turning verbs into names entirely.
Precisely. And this isn't just a technical dispute over Arabic grammar. It is rooted in a profound philosophical distinction that really forms the bedrock of how the source understands reality.
The distinction between essence and action.
Yes. Verbs represent actions. The text refers to these as ifalula, the actions of God. By definition, actions are transient. They are contextual. They start in a specific moment for a specific reason, and then they stop.
Right.
A name, however, represents absolute essence, Esmâ. And essence is eternal. It is permanent. It does not fluctuate.
So conflating the two is a massive category error.
It is the ultimate theological error. If you take a temporary context-dependent action and you permanently elevate it to the status of an essential name, you're confusing what the divine does with what the divine is.
Right. If a judge sentences a criminal to prison, the action is punishing, but the judge's essence is not the punisher. His essence is the just.
Exactly. The speaker insists that God's actions are his actions and his names are his names, and blurring that boundary pollutes the human understanding of the divine.
This is incredible. So the speaker has essentially cleared the board. He sets up these unbreakable rules: no verbal nouns, no verbs, no cherry-picking actions, only names that are explicitly grammatically stated as names.
He tosses out the historical lists entirely.
Right. He sits down, scans the entire text of the Quran through this incredibly fine filter, and manually counts what is left.
And what he found stunned even him. He openly admits his shock during the lecture.
Really? What did he think he was going to find?
Well, going into this massive, grueling research project, he operated under a common academic assumption regarding that original hadith that mentioned the number 99.
Okay.
He believed the number 99 was just a rhetorical device, a linguistic concept known as kezretin kaine.
Right, which basically means using a large, specific number as a metaphor for infinity or a multitude. Like when you tell a friend, I've called you 100 times today, you didn't literally check your call log, you just mean a lot. So he assumed God has infinite names, and 99 was just the prophet's shorthand for countless.
That was his starting premise. But after applying his uncompromising methodology, stripping away every verb and verbal noun, he tallied up the remaining explicit names. Excluding the primary proper noun Allah, the final count was exactly 99.
Exactly 99.
Not 98. Not 100.
Yeah.
Exactly 99. This mathematical precision completely shattered his previous assumptions.
I mean, that is just wild.
It proved to him that the number mentioned in the authentic tradition wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, structural, verifiable truth hidden deep within the text, just waiting for the right methodology.
The correct application of Tashi.
Yes, waiting for someone to clear away the ashes and reveal it.
That is the kind of intellectual discovery that gives you chills. But he didn't just stop at the count, did he?
No, he took it a step further.
Once he had this pristine, verified list of 99 names, he looked at how they were distributed in the text, and he did something brilliant. He arranged them chronologically, based on the historical timeline of when those specific verses were revealed.
This is known as the Nuzul Sedrasha.
Right. He separated the names into the Meccan period. So the early years, when the believers were heavily persecuted, and the Medinan period, the later years when they had established a city and a government.
And by doing this, he unlocked a completely new dimension of the text. Arranging them chronologically proved that these names were not just randomly sprinkled throughout the chapters for, like, poetic effect.
They were intentional.
Highly intentional. They were deployed as a meticulously timed educational curriculum. The divine names were prescribed as specific psychological medicine, perfectly tailored to the exact historical, social, and emotional traumas the early believers were enduring at the precise moment of revelation.
To really understand this, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of those early believers. Let's look at the Meccan period.
Okay.
During this time, the Muslims were a tiny, persecuted minority. They were physically tortured, socially ostracized, and completely stripped of economic power. They were living under a brutal boycott.
They were in a state of absolute crushing powerlessness.
Right. And it is precisely during this period of terror and blockade that the text reveals names like El-Ghaffar, the constant forgiver, El-Halik, the supreme creator, and perhaps most crucially, El-Feta, the opener.
The speaker spends significant time on El-Feta.
Imagine you are one of those early believers. You are literally starving. You have no political leverage. The society you live in has slammed every single door in your face. The future looks completely dark.
Hopeless, basically.
And right in the middle of that suffocating reality, you are introduced to a divine system governed by El-Feta. Not just an opener, but the relentless, continuous opener of all blockages. The ultimate solver of dead ends.
Think about the cognitive reframing that causes. The psychological impact is staggering. As the speaker points out, if you deeply internalize, if you achieve Marfatullah, that the universe is fundamentally governed by El-Feta, it becomes cognitively impossible to succumb to despair.
Because despair requires a belief that a blockage is permanent.
Exactly. El-Feta dictates that no blockage is permanent. The name acted as a psychological shield, revealed at the exact historical second they needed it to survive their reality.
But then history moves forward. The believers migrate, they escape Mecca, they arrive in Medina, and the context fundamentally shifts.
Completely shifts.
They are no longer a persecuted minority. They establish a city-state. They have an economy, a military, a justice system. They hold power. And as their reality changes, the curriculum of the divine names completely shifts to match it.
The evolution is striking. In the Medinan period, the text introduces names like Shakir, the appreciative, and Es-Salam, peace.
So why those names then?
The source argues this is a masterclass in contextual education. Why wasn't Es-Salam heavily emphasized in Mecca? Because to have true societal peace, you first need to be saved from active torture. You need a secure border. You need a stable society. Peace requires a foundation.
That makes perfect sense.
Furthermore, to truly understand the divine, as Shakir, the appreciative, requires a context where human beings are now engaging in complex social contracts, governance, and choices that affect a broader community. The vocabulary of the divine evolved because the capacity and the needs of the people had evolved.
It shows that the system isn't static, it's a living dialogue. Now, beyond the historical timing of when these names appear, the speaker also analyzes how they appear on a micro level.
Ah, yes, the grammar of power and wisdom.
Which brings us to a fascinating segment. He looks at how specific names are paired together at the end of verses.
The architecture of the pairings. Throughout the Quran, you frequently encounter verses that conclude with two divine names paired together. But the speaker demonstrates that these pairings are never random.
There's a rule for them too.
There is a rigid, unbreakable grammatical architecture governing them.
The order of the words is absolute. The standout example the source explores is the pairing of Aziz and Hakim.
Right. Aziz translates to mighty, powerful, or absolute in independence. Hakim translates to wise, or the source of all wisdom.
The speaker counts this exact pair appearing 28 times in the text, and every single time, without fail, it is Aziz Hakim. It is never, ever reversed to Hakimun Aziz.
Which forces the analytical mind to ask, why? In a text renowned for its poetic fluidity, why is this specific grammatical structure so inflexible?
Right, why can't they be flipped?
The speaker's analysis dives into two massive theological concepts, tenzi and teshbih.
Let's break those down because they are crucial to the speaker's argument. What's tenzi?
Tenzi is the concept of absolute transcendence. It is the declaration that the divine is completely free of any needs, limitations, weaknesses, or human-like dependencies. It is the establishment of total, unquestionable independence.
No, Aziz.
Yes. The name Aziz is the ultimate manifestation of tenzi. It declares, I am mighty. I am self-sufficient. I do not require you.
And tetsbih.
Teshbih, conversely, is about immanence and relatability. It invites human beings to see the reflections of divine attributes in the physical world, to seek out the logic, the design, and the wisdom behind how the universe operates.
Name Hakim.
Yes, the wise is a manifestation of Tesbi. It is an invitation to explore the intellect of the design.
So connecting that back to the grammar, why must Aziz always precede Hakim? Why does power always come before wisdom in this pairing?
Because, as the source brilliantly deduces, this strict grammatical rule translates into a direct, profound psychological mandate from the divine to humanity.
A psychological mandate.
The order dictates the nature of the relationship. The message encoded in the grammar is this. First, you must get it through your head that I do not need you. I am Aziz. My existence, my power, does not rely on your worship, your belief, or your comprehension. You are entirely dependent on me. I am entirely independent of you.
It is aggressively establishing the hierarchy of reality before any further conversation can happen.
Exactly. It shatters human arrogance. And then the message continues. Now that you have fully internalized my absolute power and independence, now you are permitted to listen to me. Now you can observe my actions, study the universe, and explore my wisdom. I am Hakim.
Wow.
The speaker argues that you cannot safely approach the profound wisdom of the universe until you have first completely submitted to its absolute power.
Because if the grammar were flipped, if it were Hakim then Aziz, what would happen? Human beings, in our infinite arrogance, might encounter the wisdom first and think we are equals.
We would try to debate the universe.
Right. We might think we could negotiate with the wisdom, critique the logic, or put the universe on trial before we ever respected the power behind it. The grammar itself is designed to enforce the humility required to actually learn anything.
It is a linguistic safeguard against intellectual arrogance. You must pass through the gate of submission Aziz before you are allowed into the garden of wisdom Hakim.
It is genuinely breathtaking how much psychological framing is packed into the sequence of just 2 words.
It's dense.
It is. Okay, so to recap the journey so far, we've covered the necessity of preparing the moral vessel, talim. We've explored the brutal refinement of history, blowing away the ashes of tradition by applying unbreakable linguistic rules to find the exact 99 names, tashi.
Right.
We've seen how those names functioned as a historical curriculum and how even their grammar demands humility. But this all leads to the final and arguably most difficult pillar of the speaker's entire framework.
The third pillar, tadbik.
Yes, application.
This is where the abstract theology crashes into the reality of everyday human behavior. Because for all the high-level linguistic analysis, the ultimate goal of the source is not academic mastery.
It's not just a puzzle to solve.
No, the goal is embodiment. The speaker demands that individuals actually manifest these specific, refined names in their daily interactions. You are meant to become a living reflection of the divine attributes.
And to illustrate how often we fail at this, the speaker delivers a truly sharp, deeply challenging critique of a behavior we see all the time.
Oh, they have Bismillah.
Yes. He zeroes in on the most frequently repeated phrase in the entire Islamic tradition, the Bismillah, specifically the full phrase, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, in the name of God, the Rahman and the Rahim.
Rahman and Rahim are fascinating because they both derive from the exact same Arabic root word for mercy, which is Ram. Yet they represent entirely different mechanisms and scopes of mercy.
What is Rahman?
Rahman is a broad, universal, unconditional mercy. It's the foundational mercy that sustains all of creation simply because it exists. It is the oxygen in the air, the gravity keeping us grounded, the sun shining equally on the saint, and the serial killer.
It asks for nothing in return. Universal baseline mercy.
Yes.
And what about Rahim?
Rahim is a highly specific, intimate, relational mercy. It is a targeted grace, forgiveness, and elevation reserved specifically for believers, for those who actively seek a relationship with the divine, who try, who stumble, and who ask for help. It is the mercy of a relationship.
So how does the speaker apply this to us? He describes a type of person, and honestly, as he describes this, I think we all know someone exactly like this, or maybe we even recognize it in ourselves.
It's a very common trap.
He points out a person who manifests the attribute of Rahman beautifully. This person has a broad, general compassion for the world. They are environmentalists. They donate to save the whales.
They carry bags of food in their car to feed the neighborhood's stray cats and dogs.
Right. They have deeply embraced the universal, unconditional mercy of Rahman.
But then, the speaker drops the hammer. He observes that this exact same person, who is overflowing with compassion for a stray dog, fails completely and utterly to manifest Rahim.
How so?
While they show limitless grace to animals, They show absolutely zero forgiveness, zero grace, and zero intimate mercy to their fellow human beings. Specifically to members of their own community who make a mistake, who say the wrong thing, or who stumble.
Oh, wow.
If a fellow human errs, this person is the first to cancel them, to judge them, to cast them out. They offer no rahim.
The text diagnoses this condition with a devastating phrase. They are living a half bismillah.
The hack bismillah.
You are walking through life verbally declaring, in the name of God, the universally merciful and the specifically merciful, but your actual lived existence is only halfway there.
And let's look at the mechanism of why this happens. Why is it so easy to be Rahman to a cat, but impossible to be Rahim to your neighbor?
Because the cat is easy.
Right. Because showing mercy to a cat is a one-way transaction of power. It requires no vulnerability. The cat doesn't challenge your political views. The cat doesn't betray your trust. The cat doesn't wound your ego. It is easy, safe benevolence.
But Rahim.
Rahim. Showing specific, relational mercy to a human being who has wronged you. That requires dismantling your own ego. It requires stepping off your moral high horse. It requires you to absorb an injustice and offer grace anyway.
And that is the tragedy the text is warning against. You have grasped the easy, cost-free mercy, but you are entirely starved of the difficult, complex, relational mercy that requires actual spiritual labor.
You are just mouthing the words.
You are a half bismillah. The source envisions a believer who completely rejects this hypocrisy. You must fully embrace both. You must hold on to the complete rope of these names.
The speaker describes this beautifully, saying you must hold on to these attributes sometimes with fierce enthusiasm, sometimes with passion, and often with tears.
Using the names as a ladder.
Exactly, to painstakingly pull yourself out of the decay of unutilized potential and into total alignment with the system. You don't get to pick and choose the divine attributes you wish to reflect based on what is most comfortable for your ego.
This has been an absolutely phenomenal journey through a profoundly dense text. Let's try to pull all these threads together.
It's a lot to synthesize.
It is. We started with the realization that staying outside the universal system doesn't mean we just pause. It means we decay. We explored the orbital mechanics of Ram Olmec, how aligning our tiny individual thrusters with the massive gravity of the divine will is the only way to achieve permanent, frictionless happiness.
Avoiding the fragile despair of temporary pleasures.
Right. We learned about the brutal epistemology of the East, where morality must be built before knowledge is poured in. We watched the speaker blow away the dead ashes of a 1,000-year tradition, applying merciless linguistic rules to separate the transient actions of God from the eternal essence, giving us the exact 99 names.
We discovered how those names function as a perfectly timed psychological curriculum to save the early believers.
And how the very grammar of the text forces us to submit to power before we can access wisdom. And we ended on the sharpest critique of all, the absolute necessity of daily application, the challenge of doing the hard spiritual labor required to avoid becoming a half bismillah.
If we pull back and look at the macro picture, the insights we've unpacked today transcend the boundaries of this specific theology.
They really do.
Whether you are deeply embedded in a religious framework, studying ancient Stoicism, or just a person trying to navigate your own ethical compass in a chaotic world, the rigorous demands this source places on the human mind are universally applicable.
The uncompromising demand to separate temporary actions from eternal essence.
The necessity of establishing an ethical foundation before seeking power or knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, the demand to apply your beliefs holistically, embracing the difficult, ego-destroying aspects of your values, rather than settling for a comfortable half-manifestation of your ideals.
This isn't just theology, it is a highly demanding, highly effective operating system for an authentic life.
It truly is.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your day. A thought that builds directly on the mechanics we've explored.
The alignment question.
Yes. The text argues that true, unshakable happiness is achieved when your individual desires perfectly synchronize with what the universe already intends for you. When you stop burning all your fuel trying to fly away from the gravity and instead slip into a frictionless orbit.
Stop fighting it.
Look closely at your own life right now. Look at the friction. Look at the exhaustion. Are the things you are currently stressing over, fighting for, or endlessly complaining about actually important?
Or they're merely the weariness that Job experienced.
Exactly. Distractions pulling you out of alignment with your greater purpose? What would happen tomorrow if you just stopped? What if you stopped trying to force the gears of the universe to turn your way and instead focused entirely on understanding the mechanics of the machine you are already inside?
That is the ultimate question of alignment. It asks you to stop fighting the current and learn how to swim.
Until next time, keep exploring the deep dives.
Today's material is a theological lecture exploring the linguistic methodology, chronological revelation, and practical spiritual application of extracting the 99 names of the divine directly from the source text. But jumping straight into the opening the Sia, the transition between the philosophical discussion of divine will and the highly technical methodology of linguistic extraction feels abrupt and disconnected.
Yeah, it really does, because the material begins by mapping out this deeply moving concept of Rab Mak Olmak, right?
Right, the whole idea of surrender.
Exactly. It's this profound surrender where human partial will, the Kuzi Irade, perfectly locks into place with the universal divine will, the Kyuli Irade.
Which is just a gorgeous concept.
It really is, and it frames true happiness not as some fleeting pleasure, but as reaching a state where a person can authentically say, whatever you want from me is what I want for myself.
And it uses such stunning imagery to get there too, contrasting the rose and the thorn, the shroud and the robe.
Oh yeah.
It establishes that surrendering to the divine is the absolute ultimate spiritual peak. So reading this, a listener is completely emotionally primed.
For sure. You're deeply invested at this point.
Right? You're visualizing this beautifully crafted stained glass window, moved to tears by the light shining through it. But then, literally in the very next breath, reading this section feels like driving a car and shifting from a smooth philosophical cruise about interlocking gears of will straight into the heavy off-roading of historical textual criticism without using a clutch.
Just bam, no warning at all.
Exactly. It feels like someone tapping you on the shoulder right at your moment of spiritual awe to aggressively recite the chemical equations used to manufacture that stained glass.
That is such a perfect analogy, because moving from the poetic tears of Job, Ayub alayhi salam, directly into this highly academic teardown of the hadith lists in Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, it just creates this intense structural whiplash.
Yeah, severe whiplash.
The text just plunges into chain of transmission issues, later additions, and the granular grammatical differences between an infinitive noun, a masdar, and a proper name.
Which is all valid, but...
Right, but the weakness here is that the shift from discussing partial and absolute will directly into the transmission of knowledge, the ember versus the ash, and the rejection of traditional name list creates a structural whiplash. The deep emotional resonance of surrendering to the divine is just lost when the text abruptly drops the reader into the mechanics of methodology without a clear reason why.
Exactly. The text completely fails to explain why this methodology actually matters to the spiritual stakes it just spent pages establishing.
Right. I mean, the author clearly wants to make a strong case for evaluating tradition. They use that brilliant metaphor, right? Carrying the ember of traditional knowledge forward while blowing away the ashes of unquestioned dogma.
It's a great metaphor. But because the shift is completely untethered from the opening philosophy, the reader is just left stranded in the mechanics.
Yeah, they're sitting there wondering, why do I need to care about the linguistic derivation of nouns if my only goal is to love and submit to the divine?
Which leads perfectly into the suggestion here. We need to create a thematic bridge linking the emotional necessity of spiritual submission to the intellectual necessity of correct methodology.
I love that. Because think about how a reader processes academic methodology, right? If it feels like a chore or just a purely intellectual exercise, they tune out.
Oh, immediately.
But what if we looked at this from the perspective of divine authenticity? If the ultimate spiritual goal is to align our partial will with the universal divine will, the baseline requirement is that we must be absolutely certain of who the divine actually is.
Right, we have to know exactly who we are surrendering to.
Exactly. Submitting to a human construct or some inaccurate, culturally edited projection of God defeats the entire purpose of the surrender the author just praised.
Yes.
If we accept that premise, then meticulous textual criticism isn't just for scholars in a dusty library. It is the prerequisite for a functional faith.
So, for a concrete example, the author should add a transitional paragraph right here, explaining that to truly align our will with the divine, we must know the divine accurately.
Right after the spiritual submission part.
Exactly. Explain that this pursuit of accurate connection is exactly why rigorous methodology is required to sift the ember from the ashes of tradition, turning a dry academic exercise into an absolute spiritual necessity.
That changes the tone entirely. You are clearing away the historical clutter so that the believer can lock their will into the true universal will.
And it bridges the gap seamlessly. It tells the reader, hey, because this spiritual surrender is so critical, we have to put on our hard hats and do the rigorous historical work to ensure we are getting the names exactly right.
Suddenly, the heavy off-roading has a profound sense of purpose.
Right. So establishing that rigorous methodology naturally moves us to the material's most controversial and honestly most fascinating rule, separating divine actions from divine names.
This part was so interesting.
It really is. But here's the thing. The strict differentiation between divine actions and divine names presents a compelling rule, but leaves the audience without guidance on how to spiritually process the excluded divine actions.
I mean, the text does a masterful job exposing the linguistic inconsistency in traditionalists.
It really does. It points out how traditionalists will take a verb like yamut and derive the name mumit, the bringer of death.
Right, they elevated divine action, the Isalullah, into an eternal name, the Esmâ-ül-Hüsna.
Which brings up a major theological pushback for me. If we tell readers they cannot use names like the misguider or the plotter because those are just contextual actions rather than eternal names, don't we leave a theological vacuum for the reader regarding how to actually understand those difficult actions?
Oh, 100%. Because by forcefully removing certain contextual actions from the accepted list of 99 names, the text successfully establishes a strong linguistic boundary. However, it fails to address how a believer should relate to these challenging concepts in their daily faith, leaving the reader with an unresolved tension regarding how to interpret these actions.
Right, because winning the linguistic argument in a vacuum is one thing.
Yeah, but creating a theological black hole for the everyday believer is another. Let's push on the psychological reality of the reader for a second.
Okay, let's do it.
A believer reads a verse where the divine is explicitly described as like misguiding someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they have just been told, oh, that's not a name, it's just an action, don't worry about it, they are still left holding this incredibly heavy, uncomfortable concept.
They're still stuck with the verse.
Right. If God is not eternally the misguider, what exactly is happening in that verse? You know, ignoring the discomfort doesn't just magically make it disappear.
No, it definitely doesn't, which is why the suggestion here is to briefly define the spiritual function of these contextual actions, explaining how believers should interpret and interact with them outside the framework of invoking them as names.
We desperately need a mental framework for these difficult verbs. Could the evidence support treating these actions not as standalone identities, but as necessary reactive expressions of justice?
Well, the text actually already plants the seed for this. Later in the lecture, it brilliantly analyzes the pairing of the names mighty and wise, Aziz and Hakim.
Oh, right. I remember that part.
It points out that Aziz always precedes Hakim. It establishes absolute unneedful power and boundaries first, and only then introduces the deep underlying wisdom behind the enforcement of those boundaries.
Tying the difficult actions back to Aziz and Hakim offers such a profound solution. I mean, power without wisdom is tyranny, but wisdom without power is just ineffective.
Exactly.
So when the text describes the divine applying a harsh boundary, it is demonstrating the intersection of those two eternal names. It's not a new name, it's an application of existing ones.
Yes. So, for concrete examples, the author should include a short section clarifying that while these actions aren't invoked as names because they are reactive and contextual, they should be viewed as expressions of ultimate justice applied in specific scenarios.
So tie it directly back to the pairing of mighty and wise.
Exactly. Show how an action can stem from wisdom without needing to be an eternal name. When a human being stubbornly chooses arrogance, the divine response might be described as misguiding them. But that action is not an eternal name. It is a temporary, contextual action, stemming from the divine being both mighty and wise.
That is so freeing for the reader. It demonstrates how a severe action can stem from divine wisdom without needing to be an eternal standalone identity. It completely fills that theological vacuum.
Right. It gives them a theological lens to actually process those verbs when they see them happening in the text or in the real world.
Speaking of the real world, processing these actions through the lens of human context brings us to the historical reality of the early believers.
Which is arguably the most brilliant part of the lecture. But the fascinating insight regarding the chronological revelation of the names risks being buried as a mere historical curiosity rather than a powerful tool for personal resilience.
Yeah, the author undertook a grueling, meticulous process to map the 99 extracted names to their chronological order of revelation.
It's an insane amount of work.
It really is, and we learn that the environment in which a name was revealed drastically changes how we understand its intended purpose, right?
Exactly. The observation that the opener, Al-Fatah, was revealed exclusively during the intense hardships and persecution of Mecca, while names like peace and appreciative came during the stability of Medina, it feels like a psychological roadmap for the modern believer.
It really does. The author even asks this rhetorical question. If someone knows God as Al-Fatah, the continuous opener of blocked paths, how could they ever fall into despair during the Meccan period of their struggle?
Right, but here is my question. Is the material leaving money on the table by not making that psychological connection explicit for today's audience?
Oh, totally. The material brings up a brilliant historical insight regarding the timeline of revelation, but moves past it far too quickly. By treating it mostly as evidence of methodology, it misses a major opportunity to connect the revelation order directly to the reader's modern emotional and spiritual journey.
It's basically a psychological blueprint for human resilience just sitting there.
Exactly. Leaving that rhetorical question locked in the 7th century is a huge missed opportunity.
So the suggestion here is simple. Expand the chronological analysis into a developmental framework for personal growth, mirroring the progression from historical struggle to historical stability.
Let's look at how this plays out for a modern reader. Because we all go through our own metaphorical Meccan periods, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Times of intense personal crisis, restriction, severe illness, or financial ruin. And eventually we transition into Medinan periods, times of stability, success, authority, and peace.
Right. So as a concrete example of how to implement this, the author could suggest mapping the Mecca names as spiritual anchors for readers currently going through personal crises.
Like their own metaphorical Mecca?
They are trapped in their own Meccan period of fear and restriction. That is the exact psychological moment they need to invoke the opener to find a path forward.
That is so powerful. And conversely, you can map the Medinan names as virtues to cultivate during periods of stability and power.
Right.
Imagine a different reader who just received a major promotion and stepped into a CEO role. They now possess authority, much like the early believers did when they finally established governance in Medina.
Right. They have power now.
Exactly. And that is the precise moment they need to understand the divine as the appreciative or the source of peace. If they don't anchor themselves to those specific Medinan concepts, their newfound power will inevitably curdle into arrogance and tyranny.
That turns a historical timeline into a daily spiritual coping mechanism. The lecture already does a beautiful job explaining how names must manifest in our behavior, like noting that someone cannot authentically invoke the name Rahman while failing to show Rahim or mercy to their fellow human beings.
Yeah, tying the Meccan and Medinan context directly to that behavioral application takes a dry academic concept like chronological textual analysis and transforms it into a highly practical spiritual toolkit.
It forces the historical data to sweat for the modern reader.
I love that phrasing. It takes the ember of historical fact and blows on it until it becomes a fire that warms the reader's current reality.
Beautifully put. All right, so to recap, we've laid out 3 actionable suggestions today. First, building a thematic bridge from philosophical submission to intellectual methodology.
So the reader understands why the textual criticism is actually a spiritual necessity.
Right. Second, explaining how to process excluded contextual actions by using the Mighty and Wise framework.
Resolving that theological vacuum so they know how to interact with the difficult verbs.
Exactly. And third, turning the chronological revelation of names into a personal spiritual roadmap.
I have to say, though,
The depth of research, the historical synthesis, and the sheer expertise present in this submission are truly remarkable.
It's incredibly strong material.
The author has taken a really complex, historically dense subject and constructed a crystalline methodology for navigating it.
They absolutely have. We warmly invite the listener to implement these structural and thematic changes and submit their revised work back in for another critique.
It would be great to see where they take it next.
Because ultimately, examining our faith shouldn't feel like someone aggressively reciting chemical equations at a stained glass window.
Definitely not.
It should feel like finally understanding how the light was meant to hit the glass all along.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine reading a sacred text, seeking spiritual enlightenment, and, well, walking away believing that God is essentially the misleader.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds incredibly bleak.
Right? It sounds unthinkable. But that is the actual terrifying risk of approaching theology without a strict linguistic methodology. I mean, if you play loose with grammar when interpreting the divine, you don't just make a syntax error. You create a theological catastrophe.
Okay, sure, but there's a completely different kind of catastrophe we have to worry about here. I mean, you can map out the perfect grammar of the divine, categorize every noun flawlessly, and, well, still be entirely incapable of surviving the spiritual storms of real life. A perfect theological spreadsheet. You know, it doesn't teach you how to surrender when your world falls apart.
And that tension right there brings us to our topic today. We are exploring the profound conceptual framework surrounding the beautiful names of God, the Esma-ül Hüsna. And this isn't just a historical or academic curiosity.
No, definitely not.
In this tradition, understanding these names is the absolute prerequisite for knowing the divine. It's a concept called ma'rifatullah. It's basically the psychological and spiritual mechanism through which a human being aligns their partial, limited will with the universal divine will.
Right. The goal is total synchronization. But the core disagreement in the source material we're analyzing today is really about the method of achieving that synchronization. Basically, how do we actually interact with God?
Exactly, which sets up our debate perfectly. So, my stance is that when seeking to know the divine through the text, we absolutely must rely on a strictly regulated noun-based methodology, one that aggressively separates God's eternal essence from his transient actions.
And I will argue that over-systematizing this boundary between eternal names and divine actions, it creates a sterile intellectual framework, one that frankly fundamentally ignores the dynamic, visceral reality of how believers are meant to experience God's renewing actions in their daily lives.
Well, let me start by explaining why we need uncompromising rules for how we read the text in the first place. In our intellectual tradition, there is a foundational principle, which is that ethics must precede knowledge.
Right. Ahlaktan bilgi.
Exactly. You don't just gather data. You have to be morally anchored before you approach the truth. Because if you try to jump straight to knowledge without that ethical discipline, you end up, well, projecting your own human flaws onto the divine. So we have a massive duty to sift through tradition carefully. The material actually uses a brilliant metaphor here. We're trying to carry forward the living ember of tradition while leaving behind the dead ashes of past misunderstandings.
I love that metaphor. The ember provides warmth and light, and the ashes just suffocate the fire. I completely agree with the metaphor.
Yeah, but to keep that ember alive, we can't be sloppy with our methodology. We have to draw a hard line between grammar and theology. For example, we absolutely cannot derive divine names from verbs.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, the source material makes an irrefutable point here. The Quran uses the verb yamut to describe God causing death, and from that, some commentators derive the name mumit, the bringer of death. Okay, seems harmless enough, right?
Sure, standard derivation.
But the text also uses the verb yudilu, which means to lead astray. Now, if you follow that same loose methodology, you are logically forced to derive the name Dal, attributing the title of the misleader to God.
Right, which is highly problematic.
Exactly. You've just attached a transient, contextual action to the eternal essence of the divine, and that is exactly why we need the strict boundaries.
I hear the alarm bells you're ringing. I really do. But the danger of human projection doesn't justify building a fortress that keeps the believer out. While linguistic precision is, incredibly satisfying to the intellect, the ultimate goal of this framework is application, or tatbiq.
Yes, but
It is absolute surrender to God's will. Let me finish this thought. The text literally defines true happiness as accepting both the rose and the thorn.
right, yes, but you need to know who is sending the thorn.
But the obsession with categorizing the sender detracts from the experience of receiving. The material points out that God's actions are constantly renewing. They develop, they respond. This living, breathing reality of action is exactly where the believer meets the divine. Look at the example of Job, right? When Job is suffering this devastating illness, he accepts the physical deterioration as God's action. He doesn't complain about the sickness itself. He only complains about Satan's whisperings, which are threatening his internal connection to God. Job isn't sitting in the ashes categorizing verbs and nouns, He is living the reality of surrender. By walling off verbs from names, we risk studying the vocabulary of surrender without ever actually surrendering.
I see why you think that. I do. But let me give you a different perspective on how this methodological rigor actually enhances our understanding rather than stifling it. Let's look at the actual empirical discovery discussed in the material regarding the famous number 99.
Oh, the 99 names?
Right, yeah. For centuries, theologians argued about the saying that God has 99 names. Was it literal, or was 99 just an ancient idiom for a whole lot, a metaphor for multiplicity?
Which is common, right? A lot of cultures use high numbers metaphorically, like saying, I've told you 1,000 times.
Exactly. And the traditional hadith lists, like those found in Ibn Majah and Tirmidhi, they were messy. They contained discrepancies and even names that don't appear in the Quran at all. They were full of those historical ashes we talked about, later interpolations.
Fair point.
But the material demonstrates something astonishing. When you apply the strict linguistic rules I'm advocating for, when you refuse to arbitrarily derive names from verbs, and you scan the Quran from beginning to end, you find exactly 99 names.
Exactly 99.
Exactly. With the name Allah acting as the central anchor, holding the other 99 together like the Imam of the Tasbih beads. This is an abstract philosophy. It's a breathtaking textual reality. It proves the number 99 is literal, and to me, it completely validates the rigid methodology.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why I think this supposed victory of methodology actually undermines the core spirit of the text.
Wait, how can discovering the literal mathematical truth of the text undermine it?
Because you have to ask yourself why those original lists were messy in the first place. The material itself asks a really profound question. Why did the prophet intentionally leave the 99 names unlisted in the most authentic traditions? The answer provided isn't that he forgot. It was a deliberate, pedagogical gap.
To encourage searching, sure.
Exactly. He left them unlisted so that believers would be forced to dive into the ocean of the Quran themselves. It was an invitation to struggle, to search the verses, and to build a personal relationship with the text.
And my point is that the rigorous methodology is what allows you to dive in and actually find the treasure.
Well, for the one scholar who did the finding, yes. But what happens next? By finalizing a mathematically perfect, definitively closed list of 99 names based on modern grammatical rules, aren't we just generating a new pile of ashes for the next generation?
I wouldn't call it ashes.
We are handing them a completed spreadsheet instead of an invitation to dive into the ocean. We take a dynamic, participatory command to seek, and we turned it into a static doctrine to memorize. Embers require the oxygen of inquiry to stay hot. When you solve the puzzle for everyone, you cut off the oxygen.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. Establishing the baseline truth of the text doesn't prevent future generations from experiencing the search. It prevents them from distorting the findings. Think about mapping an ocean. Knowing the coordinates of a reef doesn't stop you from experiencing the beauty of scuba diving. It just stops you from crashing your boat into it.
Okay, I like that analogy.
But I don't want to just talk about the list in isolation. I want to look at how these strictly defined names are actually deployed in the text, because this reveals an incredible structural brilliance.
You mean the chronological order of the revelations?
Yes, when you map these carefully isolated names chronologically against the history of the early believers, a profound educational strategy emerges. The material highlights that a name like Al-Fatah, the opener, the one who clears blocked paths, appears exclusively in the early Meccan verses. Now let's unpack why.
Right.
The early Muslim community in Mecca was intensely oppressed. They were physically persecuted, politically marginalized, financially blockaded. They were quite literally trapped.
So they needed a specific psychological anchor.
Precisely. They desperately needed the hope that only the opener could provide. But conversely, names like Ash-Shakir, the appreciative, and As-Salam, the source of peace, only arrive later, after the migration to Medina. Why? Because the manifestation of societal peace and mutual appreciation requires the establishment of a community, a safe haven, a structure of power.
The theology is perfectly tailored to the sociology on the ground.
It goes even deeper than that. Look at the paired names that often end verses. They are strictly, immutably ordered. We constantly see Aziz Hakim, the Almighty followed by the wise. You never ever see Hakim Aziz.
Let's unpack the mechanism there. Why does the sequence of those two specific nouns matter so much for your argument?
Because of how it operates on the human ego. If God introduced himself as Hakim, wise first, the arrogant human mind might try to negotiate. We might say, well, my wisdom says this tragedy isn't fair, so let's debate.
Right, we try to rationalize it.
Exactly. But Aziz establishes absolute transcendent power. It tells the human being, I am the Almighty. I don't need you. You are entirely dependent on me. It acts as a massive ego check. Once that independence is established and the ego submits, then comes Hakim. Now that you realize your powerlessness, understand that my decrees possess ultimate wisdom. This brilliant, unchangeable, structural order relies entirely on these names being static, permanent pillars of the divine essence.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that this incredible chronological brilliance actually proves the exact opposite of your point?
The opposite?
Yes. It supports the primacy of dynamic action over static essence.
How so? The nouns themselves, opener, almighty, wise, they aren't changing.
The nouns aren't changing on the page, but their deployment is fiercely dynamic. Think about what you just described. The names adapt their appearance to the sociological and psychological needs of the community in real time, offering hope in Meccan hardship, building societal structure in Median establishment, dismantling the ego with Aziz before healing it with Hakim.
Okay, but
they are functioning exactly like the dynamic verbs you are so eager to exclude.
I'm not sure I follow. An intentional timing doesn't turn a noun into a verb.
It turns the relationship into a verb. They are acting as living interventions. They renew, they tasid edach, based on the context of the believer. The chronological deployment shows a God who interacts with human history actively, responding to our suffering and our triumphs. If God's interaction with us is constantly shifting and adapting to our state, then forcing believers to focus exclusively on eternal, unchanging nouns distances them from the very real, action-oriented way God is actually treating them.
Yeah, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you're conflating the delivery mechanism with the medicine itself. Yes, a doctor might give you a stimulant in the morning and a sedative at night. That's a dynamic schedule. But the chemical composition of the medicine must remain absolute and unchanging, otherwise it poisons you.
Okay, that's fair.
The attributes themselves must remain anchored in the eternal noun. And this brings us to what happens when we lose that definitional anchor in daily application.
The reality of tatbiq. Let's bring this down to earth.
Exactly. I will argue that separating these names from transient actions is what ultimately fixes our broken daily practices. The material gives us a devastatingly practical example regarding the two primary names of mercy, Rahman and Rahim.
Both derived from the concept of divine womb-like mercy, but functioning differently.
Right. Rahman represents universal, unconditional mercy. It is the grace that sustains all creation, the sun shining on everyone, regardless of their belief or behavior. But Rahim is specific, active, reciprocal mercy. It is the mercy given to those who do the work of faith. Now, the material points out a tragic irony in modern believers.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
You will see someone who manifests Rahman beautifully. They show immense compassion to animals. They feed stray cats and dogs. They donate to environmental causes. Yet they completely fail to manifest Rahim.
Meaning they show absolutely no mercy or forgiveness to their fellow human beings.
Exactly. They hold vicious grudges against a colleague who made a mistake, or they cut off family members over petty disputes. They are manifesting universal mercy to creatures that don't challenge their ego, but failing to show specific reciprocal mercy to humans who do.
Right.
It is a massive spiritual blind spot. And here is my core point. You cannot fix that blind spot if you don't intellectually understand the strict definitional boundary between Rahman and Rahim. You have to have the theological map to realize you are only navigating half the ocean. That is why the intellectual framework must be rigorous.
I come at it from a different way. I agree the imbalance is tragic. We all know people who love humanity in the abstract but can't stand their neighbor. But the failure to manifest Rahim to a fellow human being isn't a failure of linguistic categorization.
It's not?
No. The individual hasn't failed a theological vocabulary test. They have failed to surrender their ego.
But the intellect guides the heart. I mean, how can you embody a specific type of mercy if you haven't clearly defined what it is?
Because true knowledge, in this tradition, true marifet to law, isn't just knowing the dictionary definitions of God's attributes, it's being entirely consumed by his reality. The material emphasizes that true happiness is indestructible because it is tied directly to surrender. Fulfilling your desires gives you fleeting pleasure, but pleasure evaporates the moment the stimulus is gone. True happiness stays because it is rooted in accepting whatever God sends.
I definitely agree with the distinction between pleasure and happiness. But how do you achieve that acceptance without the framework?
Let's ground this in modern reality. Say you lose your job unexpectedly, or you experience a sudden, brutal grief. The mechanism of happiness in this tradition is the ability to say, whether you send a rose or a thorn, a robe of honor or a burial shroud, it is all pleasing to me.
Right.
If you are sitting in the ashes of your ruined career, obsessing over whether this event represents a transient verb or an eternal noun, you are completely distracted from the radical, ego-dissolving surrender that the moment demands. The living, breathing actions of God, the things that make us weep in the middle of the night, the things that make us smile, these are the actual curriculum of our spiritual evolution. The grammar doesn't save you. The surrender does.
That is a beautiful sentiment, but I think it creates a false dichotomy between intellectual rigor and spiritual surrender. The source material powerfully demonstrates how these two things absolutely must coexist. Think about your example of losing a job. Yes, we must accept the thorn, but we must also have the theological maturity to know that the thorn is a transient action.
You really think the strict categorization is what protects our faith during those painful moments?
Absolutely. Let's go back to the misleader catastrophe from earlier. If you lose your job and you don't have a strict boundary between God's actions and his essence, you might look at your suffering and conclude, God is cruel. You attach the transient action of your suffering to his eternal nature.
By carefully, methodically isolating the eternal names from changing actions, we protect our understanding of God from our own trauma and human projection. We find the literal truth in the text, the exact 99 names, and we use them as an unshakable psychological foundation. We do the hard intellectual work of blowing away the historical ashes so we can actually hold the true living ember of the tradition.
Okay, I'll concede the brilliance of the textual analysis. The discovery of the 99 names through that rigorous framework is undeniably powerful. And, well, you make a very fair point about the danger of projecting our temporary pain onto God's eternal nature. We do need anchors, but I maintain that the ultimate wisdom in the material lies in its relentless call to embrace the messiness of divine manifestation in our daily lives.
So you're saying the map is useless if you never leave the house?
Exactly. The living, breathing actions of God, the thorns, the tears, the renewing verbs, the unpredictable ways life unfolds, they are just as vital for attaining true, indestructible happiness as memorizing the eternal nouns. The intellect gives us the map, yes, but it is the raw, unmediated experience of God's actions that actually forces us into the water. It is the only way we learn to synchronize our partial human will with the universal divine will.
Well, it seems we arrive at a profound point of convergence then. We both recognize the central warning of the material. Traditional knowledge must be a living ember, not dead ash.
We have to carry the fire, not the soot.
And carrying that fire requires balance. It requires both the rigorous intellect to define the boundaries of who God is and the profound, ego-dissolving spiritual surrender to experience what God does within our lives. The text itself is an invitation. We invite our listeners to dive into the source material themselves. Don't just take our word for it. Search the text, wrestle with these concepts, and form your own relationship with the beautiful names.
Because ultimately, whether you find comfort in meticulously charting the coordinates, or you find God by learning to surrender to the crashing waves, the ocean is waiting for you.
A perfect thought to end on. We'll leave you to consider the vastness of that ocean and your own place within it.